So I guess I'll just get started. Foucault remarks in his 1979 lecture, Pastoral Power and Political Reason, I think that the word rationalization is a dangerous one. The main problem when people try to rationalize something is not to investigate whether or not they conform to the principles of rationality, but to determine which kind of rationality they are using. I would say this is also the case for those experiences which are talked about as below, beside, between, or in excess of words. To paraphrase Foucault, it is not the problem to investigate whether certain experiences are ineffable or not, but to determine the particular kind or kinds of ineffability in which they participate. It is in this spirit that I discuss my experiences in the Akashic Records using the category of intermodal exchange to triangulate some of the particular alinguistic and somatic ineffabilities in which reading the records participates. I then turn my attention to evocations of and reflections drawn from these experiences themselves. In pre-object relatedness, early attachment, and the psychoanalytic situation, Ivry Kumin explores the relationship of intermodal exchange to pre-object relatedness. Put most simply, Kumin argues that intermodal exchanges may account for the otherwise ineffable or uncanny in the psychoanalytic situation. He then gives several examples of the kinds of events he has in mind. Among these are moments, 1, when the analyst intuits that a patient has had an important dream before the patient themselves remembers, and 2, exchanges that occur between mothers, babies, and analysts. Here's what I often notice, he remarks. If the interpretation of the mother's conflict is apt, her baby calms down. From the perspective of pre-object relatedness, the mother's newfound calmness is transmitted directly to her infant via an intermodal exchange, which enables the baby to be calmer or to fall asleep. I believe that the transmission of relief is direct and does not rely on an intervening symbolic representation. But, Kumin argues, such effective intermodal exchanges do not only occur in analysis. They are important parts of creative expression and aesthetic appreciation, as well as our experiences of the humorous and enjoyment of the absurd. As Kumin relates, I once made an absurd rejoinder to a friend's comment. He laughed long and hard and then said, "I don't get it." I had also thought my remark was funny, although I didn't understand what I had meant either. You had to be there, as they say. You had to be there, because only then would all the complex gestural, affective, and bodily intermodal signifiers be present to make the joke funny despite its verbal content. This is the essence of pre-object communication. You have to be there to get it. Because its function is to precipitate a new sensation in another rather than to signify or approximate a past mental event, the pre-object state can only exist in the sensoromotor here and now of a relational field. Intermodal exchanges, then, though they do not necessarily occur separately from language, can exceed, undergird, accompany, or precede linguistic utterance. Kumin's emphasis upon the alinguistic aspect of our communication and encounters with others is a contrast to those accounts of the psychoanalytic situation, and indeed models of subjectivity in general, which place language at the center of our experience. Charles Moy, for example, states, transference and countertransference turn the analytic session into a space where the two participants encounter the place of the other in language. In intermodal exchange, as Kumin constructs it, the other is importantly not just the other encountered in language, but the other or others that are felt sitting right beside us as we sense them and they sense us. Switching modes, I note that this element of alinguistic exchange within a complex relational field is an important element of both the medieval Tibetan Buddhist and medieval European contemplative literature I study. In these environments, despite their immense differences, there is a great deal of emphasis placed upon the importance of what words may and may not do. It is a very different thing for Longchenpa, a 14th century Tibetan, to receive a direct transmission and empowerment from his heart teacher, or Nirlana Kumaradsa, than it is for him to, have studied dharmic texts, though sometimes the two overlap. Likewise, for Bernard of Clairvaux, a 12th century abbot, a kiss from a divine bridegroom is a very different experience than that of reading the Song of Songs for its discursive content. In such intermodal exchanges, to use Kuhlmann's term, the content of the experience, though it may be evoked by or occur through words, is not encompassed by them. The essential content of these experiences is rather the affective exchange that occurs between two entities, in this case, one incarnate and one disincarnate. In my Akashic work, let's see. Come back up. It's all right. I'll just keep reading this. Okay, so the image I wanted to share was actually of the space in which I've been taught to read the records. And it would have been shared with permission of the lady that I've learned to read them from, named Nancy Kern. But I'll just go ahead and read forward. So, in my Akashic work, I learned through at once the physical presence and transmission of my own teacher, Nancy Kern, as well as through her verbal and written instructions. In reading the Akashic Records, rather than opening a big book in the sky or letting a physical tome fall open on our laps, instead we open a complex and multidimensional relational field. And in this field, we then engage in intermodal exchanges with both incarnate and disincarnate others. And this is the Akashic Record, as I understand it. Having said a little bit about the particular kinds of ineffability concerned in reading the Akashic Records, I now turn my attention to 3 reflections drawn directly from my own experiences in the Akasha. As Bernard himself once put it, in libro experiencia legimus, let us read in the book of experience. Reflection 1. Not past lives, simultaneous lives. Reading the Akashic Records has a strong affinity with past life work. But in my readings, I have found that rather than feeling past, my experiences of so-called past lives often seem, especially in the Akasha itself, as real and as immediate as memories from this life, broadly conceived as the present. Time in the Akasha dilates, bends, flows, stills. It is not a linear progression. In contrast to Tibetan Buddhist accounts of past lives which use the metaphor of a garland or mala to evoke the relation of incarnations to each other, my Akashic experiences are better evoked by the metaphor of a shimmering web, a net, or even a constellation of stars. In fact, multiple lives in the Akasha feel more like a different Tibetan Buddhist visualization, that of the field of refuge. It is also the case that this network of incarnations is not so much an image, though it is a powerful image, but a sensation. It is as if, to extend the metaphor, I were poised, a dewdrop at the node of a suspended spider's web, around me other glimmering drops, some of which are also, in some way, me, some of which are not. In encountering multiple incarnations in the Akasha, I do not feel as if I am a central consciousness with others as subsidiaries. Rather, in the Akasha, I have the potential to visit, overlap, communicate, to learn, and engage in an intermodal exchange with them. To give a concrete example of this time-warpy ball of timey-wiminess, as a teenager, I had a vivid experience of a strong, female presence visiting me and comforting me when I was physically very sick and emotionally upset. Subsequently, raised within a Christian context, I decided that the being that had visited me was the Virgin Mary. But, to the contrary, last year in an Akashic session, I found myself sitting with myself during that precise event. Though I initially thought the presence was a being other than myself, it was instead an as of yet unrealized aspect of myself, one that was separate from my initial frame of religious reference. Another time, working with a medieval life, I arrived in a similar situation. In that particular life, I was in a male body, a monk. I had vivid memories of going to a specific bench on a hillside that had a view of a long green valley, where at that time I went to feel anger and grief. There, too, I, the monk, was visited by another comforting feminine aspect of myself that I then, in that life, too inscribed into my particular worldview as the Virgin. But participating in this experience in my body in this life, I felt myself neither completely the monk nor the female spirit, but as if I sat with them, observing them both. Other times, I shifted and was completely inside the monk's experience, at others not. Near the end of the session, this male incarnation that was and was not myself turned to look at me, where I was sitting beside him. At this point, instead of feeling that I observed and participated in his effective experience, I felt that he shared in mine. From the point of view of where I live and who I am now, this was a past life. Within the experience and the Akasha itself, this life was simultaneous with and as important as my own. Such atemporal exchanges are ordinary within the records. Reflection 2, layered embodiments. Experiences in the Akasha unfold in different ways. Sometimes events unfold almost cinematically with a strong, concretely visual component. Other times, experiences are primarily emotional. Others still are constituted by strong movements of energy. Regardless of their particular modal affinities, these experiences are always effective and embodied. These exchanges also have multiple layers, as if of transparent films of sensation. An essential aspect of Akashic work consists in building the psychic, emotional, affective, energetic, physical, and attentional stamina to allow these layers to organically and somatically arise, or to blossom, to crackle, or strike. Each of these embodied layers of sensation carries within it a mix of representational or pre-representational content. Sometimes this content is interpretable linguistically, but many times it's not. Instead, these overlapping waves of sensation often require the participation of a particular physical and/or psychic center, or effective engagement with an emotion held within a network of locations within the body. These experiences have caused me to consider that perhaps many of the epistemological statements made in contemplative literature might in fact be literal, not figurative. That is, it really is the case that certain kinds of knowledge might only be accessed with the hands, the womb, the intellect, or the heart. That it is perhaps no accident that in Longchenpa's encounter with the goddess Saraswati, the goddess of melodious speech, he receives a transmission from her directly through his throat corlo, or wheel, or chakra. Or that in Bernard's encounter with the divine bridegroom or the child Christ, when he himself was a child, that the means of transmission is a kiss. From an Akashic perspective, the head has no monopoly on knowledge. Instead, the whole body becomes a field of multiple knowings held in complex somatic relationship with each other. Reflection 3, multidimensional genders and sexualities. Many important tensions in current discussions of gender and sexuality can be understood as participating in a negotiation between biologically essentialist or socially constructivist performative accounts of these aspects of our experience. And so that's speaking really broadly, but due to my work in the Akashic Records, as well as my long-term exposure to Tibetan Buddhist material in my research, I've become interested in the implications of multi-life as opposed to single-life models and what they might mean for these theories. What if we were to consider the possibility of multiple past or simultaneous incarnations, and their somatic layering is constitutive of our present gendering, sex, and sexuality? In my Akashic work, I have experienced being male or female sexed in multiple incarnations. I have also had experiences of being intersex, incompatibly sexed and gendered, and being non-human. Okay, thank you. These experiences appear as spectral somatic sensations in my body. To be concrete here, this is not some abstract or transcendent femaleness or maleness or non-binariness. In these moments, I sense myself as having the actual ordinary sensation of a different body. I do not just feel, sense, or remember myself as a man, but always feel myself to have been a specific man at a particular time and place who had some experiences and not others. Or, if I was a woman, I am always a particular woman who did or did not have a child, who was or was not attracted to a particular kind of person. I have also had intersex experiences in which I am likewise host to a whole different, equally somatically specific set of sensual layers and memories. All of these experiences are themselves layered over and arise within my own body as it is sexed and gendered in this life. I do not consider myself to be encountering, therefore, an abstract or generalized inner masculine or feminine. I also do not consider myself to be beyond or to transcend gender in an Akashic state. I also do not consider myself to be encountering archetypical animus or anima figures. Instead, I encounter in my body and in its sex and gendered somatic layerings a history of individual and particulate moments of being. Connected to these experiences of being multiply gendered and sexed are also their concomitant erotic histories and predilections, their sexualities. This aspect may or may not show up as a memory of an erotic encounter or series of encounters with other incarnate individuals from a particular life, but also as spiritual or perhaps even mystical encounters with particular deities or other disincarnate entities over multiple or within one singular specific lifetime. Based upon these experiences, I find it less and less convincing that there is some singular, abstract, masculine or feminine spiritual essence that is the same for everyone. Instead, I perceive myself and others as a series of instantiations and incarnations, each contextualized as specific beings and bodies with their own desires. In Akashic work, these subjectivities are allowed to exist in a net of conscious, effective relationship with each other. Phrased more philosophically, in Akashic work, rather than discovering abstract or disembodied spiritual essences, I feel I am performing a multi-incarnational and embodied genealogy of my own somatic present. Thank you. In conclusion, as I give this talk, I am Anne, but I am also many others, aware of the weight of a different set of garments, of the smell of morning and of a certain kind of hay, different buildings and slants of light, of different nights and days, even as I also sense now the weight of these clothes here and now, the taste of this water, the feeling of this hair against my neck. I am also a hawk falling quickly to strike, the air parting around me as I careen toward a mouse. I am a young monk being beaten by his master for misbehaving. I am a woman who I am not yet, in a blue dress, pink climbing roses slung around her waist. I am an alien consciousness whose thought feels as if it were a net of fireflies shivering through my occipital lobe, non-discursive, deeply systematic. I am not one or all things. I am multiple specific things, all in affective exchange with one another, and right here, now, with you. Put evocatively, in a poem that came to me in an Akashic session in January of this year, what are the Akashic Records? Seated in the wide open sky, you discover the whole world itself already is your support, as if you floated on clearest water, your choice to dive or drift. Sometimes you are seated in a field of stars, or tumble back into the very first instant you entered your mother's salty womb. Or remember what it is to be a blue whale or a gnat, to run as a quick doe runs with heaving flanks, to be beaten or taken apart, to be helpless without connection to love or will. Sometimes you remember the hurt you have done, or the rejection you have received, or sucking at a celestial mother's breasts. And in the heart of your abandonment, remember, I have always been made of heaven. This is what the Akasha teaches, and what it allows you to allow yourself to live. Thank you for listening as I have read from the book of my experience aloud to you. And as I thank you, I also acknowledge that there is so much more that has happened while I've been speaking than my words, and that whatever this event is here now could only happen because of our presence and our bodies here together in this relational field. I couldn't have done it without you, as they say. You had to be here to get it.
That's the first question. So, how are you going to integrate this with history? Yeah, I mean, because I know your work, and I know you have to write a dissertation that presumably has to take on some kind of historical framework, but you also live in this world in which there is no history. It's all simultaneous.
Right.
So how are you going to, maybe you won't, I don't know, it's just a question. It's not a challenge.
Well, one of the things that I've discovered in my practice is that I actually do a lot of Akashic work around my research. So, for example, I will actually, in the Akasha, ask Freud to help me with a problem. and what's interesting is usually it's not discursive content. Instead, I'll receive almost a kind of energetic understanding of something that was going on that's quite visceral usually, and I'll suddenly see a series of connections that I couldn't see before. And so something becomes clear to me analytically, ultimately, but in the Akasha itself, it's something that's feeling. And so how it works with my historical work is, in fact, that I think a lot of it's caused me to take more seriously, actually, the statements that the people that I study make about being, in sort of timeless states or having contact with somebody, that preceded them or within their own lifetime, or to take seriously the idea that Longchenpa, in contact with his teacher, Kumaradsa, that there was something that he got from just sitting next to him. And so at the same time, temporality is important and physical locality is important, but it's not the whole story.
So as a potential advisor,
what
I would say to you as a graduate student is, please don't tell anyone that.
Yeah.
Right? So, but also, I think it's the most important thing that you're saying. And so how do we do that as academics? How do we conceal really what's at the core of who we are and what we're doing, and yet still survive in a social or professional field? And maybe that's the source of esotericism. That's why there have always been secrets, because people have always had to exist in these social and political and professional fields, and yet that's not really what they're doing, not who they are.
Yeah, and with the Akashic work as well, there's some stuff that I feel comfortable sharing and other stuff that I don't. So, there are layers of kind of secrecy even within the secrecy.
I'm thinking of a job interview.
Yeah. I probably wouldn't bring it up in a job interview.
Okay.
So you can breathe easy.
Okay. I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Hi. And I have a question. I'm studying a Swedish artist, Nancy Kern.
Okay.
And she was actually working quite a lot with Akashic Records. When she started, she received a mission from Spirit and started a series of paintings. And just at the beginning, she was working quite a lot with Akashic Records. And the first group of paintings is called Primordial Chaos, and it's about the beginning of life and the history of the world and the humanity, right? I'm a bit curious what you have to say about this, because I understood that in Martin mainly interpreted the Akashic Records from Ledbetter and Rudolf Steiner, and they were all about, this is the source for the unknown history, that the history books can't tell us, but this is the real history that you receive from the Akashic Records. And I think that Martin was very influenced by that. But I'm wondering, how is history in that sense, in the Akashic Records for you?
I'm not familiar with that artist's work. I can say that the woman that I received and continue to receive the sort of Akashic training from is herself a visual artist, an incredible sort of abstract worker who paints actually her experiences. I don't know much beyond what she's told me, which she received this particular kind of mode of reading the records from a woman named Mary Parker in Central Texas. And I don't know, sort of the history of that particular practice of reading the records. I do know that there's a lot out there about, sort of Akasha or space or ether as kind of an element, but I don't know that particular lineage. And so I couldn't speak to, that particular artist.
You haven't revisited events in history or any sort of those themes?
Well, I would say that, I've visited some Neolithic sites and done sort of Akashic work around that, and, I feel a connection to some of them that's very old. But, the question then becomes, how do you interpret that feeling? And what does it really mean? And so, that's where it gets interesting to me. Yeah.
So what, it's sort of a combination of the last two questions. Could you speak to your decision and interest to express this in an academic and linguistic setting, and if there is potential or value in finding a non-linguistic means of expanding conversation, these conversations, or the word for what I'm asking, but expanding sort of shared gnosis of Akashic Records.
Yeah. So I didn't put this in, but I kind of wanted to, so it's great that this is coming up now. There's this great moment when, in the introduction to one of my advisor's books, Knowledge and Liberation by Anne Klein, and she tells this story about the Dalai Lama where he's just talked about, there's all of this material that's written about what you can't say and what you can't, encompass in writing in Tibetan material, like it's all of this ineffable stuff that you're writing about. And sort of when he was pushed on that, what he said was, well, it's inexpressible, but it's not all that inexpressible. and so I think, with this, it's like it's not impossible to say, it's this particular kind of experience that I can't describe. Like it's like this and not like these other things. And I think at the same time appreciating that there's a quality to, I would say that it's almost like there's a quality to our experience that's always secret. So in giving this talk to you, I had this sort of discursive content, but we were all having our own experiences while this was going on, whether or not that related to my talk or not. And so that's always there. And I think that is underappreciated in academic environments. And that's part of my focus in the field of contemplative studies, I would say, is to bring attention to the aspects of knowledge and knowing in our potentialities for knowing that are not always discursive. And they're always present in the academic environment, even if we're not acknowledging them or specifically cultivating them. And And so I don't think that's maybe a full answer to your question, but I really consider that these are just part of our experience. Whether or not they're specifically Akashic or not, the kinds of sort of affective and intermodal exchanges, for example, as Cumin talks about, like they're part of our being as bodies, whether or not we choose to consciously participate with them or develop an awareness of them, or draw attention to them. And so that's where it would fit in that realm for me. Yeah.
Thank you. I hate to cut this.
No, that's okay.